I never expected that moving to Gulfview Isles would land me in a high-stakes conflict with an HOA official so determined to bulldoze the very shelters that kept us safe from hurricanes. My name is Alexandra Hollingsworth, though in my professional life, I'm known as the director of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. After spending years coordinating disaster responses nationwide, I craved a quiet coastal spot to unwind. The pastel houses lining Gulfview Isles, with palm trees swaying and a gentle salt breeze drifting in, promised a serene life away from bureaucratic chaos. It wasn't until after I closed on a charming stucco home with a wraparound porch that I learned about the neighborhood's hyper-involved HOA. The association's self-appointed star was Marcia Ardini, known behind her back as Karen for her aggressive, know-it-all style. She was in her mid-50s, with hair perpetually teased into a neat bob and a habit of wearing bright blazers to project authority. I dismissed the rumors at first. After all, any community might have an overbearing neighbor or two. How bad could it be? The first few weeks were peaceful. I hung wind chimes on my porch, took morning walks along the sandy roads, and occasionally waved at neighbors. I told none of them my real job, head of FEMA, preferring to blend in. My role often attracted attention or pleas for favors, and I wanted a normal suburban life. Then came an early summer HOA meeting. I showed up to introduce myself. Karen presided at the front, brandishing her thick binder of covenants and regulations. She gave a grandiose speech about protecting property values and maintaining an elite standard of living. Mild as it was, I caught a whiff of arrogance in her tone. The board members nodded politely, some with forced smiles. They seemed used to her pushiness. I also noticed a mention in the meeting minutes about renovating or repurposing the community's hurricane shelters. The conversation quickly shifted, but a red flag rose in my mind. This region was hurricane-prone. A well-maintained shelter could mean the difference between life and death in a Category 4 storm. Later that night, I wondered, why would they talk about removing or repurposing them? I brushed it off as typical meeting chatter, not suspecting how dire the plan truly was. Over the next month, I settled into a comfortable routine. By day, I split my time between teleconferences with FEMA staff in D.C. and site visits across the region to ensure readiness for hurricane season. By evening, I relaxed on my porch or strolled the neighborhood. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of Karen roaming about, measuring lawn heights or scolding kids for skateboarding on sidewalks. Some neighbors rolled their eyes at her micromanagement. But for the most part, life was pleasant. One afternoon, I noticed some official-looking posters going up around the neighborhood. Proposal to revitalize common grounds. Clubhouse coming soon. The flyers bore the HOA logo, with Karen's name at the bottom as the main sponsor. A neighbor, Ms. Daniels, whispered to me that Karen had big plans to demolish the old hurricane shelters near the community greenbelt to build a private clubhouse. She thinks those shelters are an eyesore, Ms. Daniels said, rolling her eyes. But we always use them during storms. I've hidden there twice in bad hurricanes. Alarm bells rang in my head. Gulfview Isles was vulnerable to storm surges and fierce winds, with the nearest city shelters miles away. The large, reinforced structures the neighborhood maintained served as first-line safe havens if a hurricane made sudden landfall or evacuation routes jammed. Tearing them down for a fancy clubhouse? That was madness. At the next HOA meeting, I listened quietly as Karen pitched her vision. She displayed glossy mock-ups of a sleek clubhouse with a pool, lounge, and palm fringe patio. She insisted it would raise property values and create a more exclusive environment. When one board member asked, "What about the shelters?" Karen shrugged. "They're old and ugly, hardly used. We have official city shelters if needed, don't we?" Some members looked uneasy but remained silent. Others, possibly swayed by Karen's force of personality, nodded. Finally, I raised my hand. With hurricane season approaching, removing functional shelters could be risky. Some folks rely on them if they can't evacuate in time. Karen glared, as though I'd suggested something outrageous. "The city or FEMA can handle big storms," she snapped. "We don't need shabby community bunkers that drag down aesthetics." I bit my tongue, not revealing my identity. But inside, I seethed at her ignorance. Hurricanes were a serious threat, not a trivial matter. After the meeting, a few neighbors thanked me for speaking up, confessing they feared Karen's wrath if they objected. I assured them we'd figure something out. My FEMA instincts told me that if Karen bulldozed these shelters, we'd be in grave danger come the next storm. Little did I know, Karen's plan would escalate far beyond a mere discussion. Summer marched on, heat intensifying. Hurricane forecasts started cropping up on local news. Meteorologists warned it might be an active season. I kept an eye on weather reports, aware that the ocean's temperatures were higher than usual, fueling potential storms. Meanwhile, Karen lobbied hard for her clubhouse project. She circulated a petition among homeowners, touting increased property values and a grand social hub. She conveniently omitted the part about demolishing the shelters. Some signed, dazzled by her promises of a fancy new amenity. Others hesitated, but Karen pressured them, leaving them feeling cornered. Soon, she claimed a majority supported the plan. One Saturday, a friend of mine from the local FEMA office, Greg, came by for a barbecue at my place. We walked around the greenbelt, and I showed him the hurricane shelters, rugged concrete bunkers, partially underground, each with thick walls and a sturdy metal door. "These are crucial," Greg murmured, tapping the wall. "If a Category 3 or 4 hits with short notice, folks can hunker down here. Tearing them down is insane." I explained Karen's clubhouse scheme. Greg shook his head in disbelief. "We might need to file an official objection if they proceed. Even if these are private property, local codes likely require neighborhood hurricane safety measures." The next day, I tried to reason with Karen privately. I found her weeding in her yard, wearing gardening gloves. "Karen," I said gently, "I know you want to improve the community, but removing those shelters is dangerous. We should keep them in top condition." She barely looked up. "You obviously don't get it. We're evolving. People don't want ugly bunkers in their scenic neighborhood. That's so outdated." Her voice dripped with condescension. I tried to calmly point out the real risk. Hurricanes can intensify quickly. Shelters save lives. Maybe we can have both, a smaller clubhouse built elsewhere. But Karen sniffed. "Not necessary. The motion to demolish is practically past. If you want to preserve worthless concrete blocks, talk to the city. I'm sure they'll side with me about modernization." Her arrogance fanned my anger. If only she knew I actually spearheaded hurricane preparedness at the highest federal level. But I kept that card hidden, figuring I could handle it without exposing my role. How wrong I was. The tension was about to explode as hurricane season loomed. As July ended, weather experts flagged a brewing tropical system far in the Atlantic. They projected it might strengthen into a tropical storm, but it was too early to forecast landfall. Still, those of us with disaster expertise took note. Conditions in the ocean were ripe for rapid intensification. Despite the warning signs, Karen pushed forward with her demolition plan. At an HOA meeting, she announced that the board had voted, in a close margin, to proceed with the clubhouse proposal. The first step, tearing down the old hurricane shelters to free up land for construction. A few neighbors voiced alarm. What if a storm came soon? Karen dismissed them. "We'll have a new clubhouse built with strong materials," she declared, ignoring that a clubhouse with large windows and a pool deck is hardly the same as a fortified bunker. Ms. Daniels and I both try to protest. "At least wait until the season ends," Ms. Daniels pleaded. "Why risk it now?" But Karen was steadfast. "Contractors are ready. We can't delay or we'll lose the quotes." She hammered the gavel. Meeting adjourned. Many left the room, deeply concerned. In private, Ms. Daniels confided, "I'm scared, Alexandra. My father uses a wheelchair. If roads flood, he can't just leave easily. That shelter was our fallback." I assured her we'd find a solution. I considered stepping in as FEMA director, but it felt drastic to pull rank. Typically, FEMA doesn't police private HOA decisions. Yet this was life-threatening for hundreds of residents. Time was running out. The next morning, bulldozers rumbled onto the greenbelt. Karen oversaw them, directing them to begin dismantling the bunkers. People looked on, horrified, as the heavy equipment chipped away at thick concrete walls that had withstood storms for decades. Dust filled the air, chunks of rebar sticking out. Once the machines finished, they loaded the debris into trucks. Karen watched with a triumphant smirk. My fists clenched. I'd seen families lose everything in storms. Now my own neighborhood was losing a crucial safety net. I texted Greg, letting him know what happened. He responded, "This is so reckless. Let me see if local building codes were violated. You might have grounds to halt the project." With a bitter taste in my mouth, I realized Karen's unstoppable arrogance might require more direct action, and a swirl of dread formed in my gut. With shelters gone, if a hurricane struck, we'd be in dire straits. Days later, the tropical system in the Atlantic strengthened to a full-fledged hurricane. It was named Hurricane Cameron, and meteorologists projected it might track toward the Gulf Coast. Still, uncertainty reigned. Sometimes storms veered away, but the possibility that it could strike near us, with the neighborhood shelters now gone, haunted me. Meanwhile, Karen wasted no time celebrating her victory. Construction crews arrived, leveling the ground where the shelters once stood, pouring the foundation for a future clubhouse. She posted updates in the HOA newsletter, hailing it as a new era of upscale living. Many neighbors were furious, but she had just enough loyal supporters who believed the clubhouse would elevate property values. They overlooked the safety concerns, trusting the local city shelters, or simply believing storms wouldn't be that bad. But the truth was that city shelters were 10 miles inland. In a fast-approaching hurricane, the roads could become flooded or congested. The old bunkers had been an immediate refuge. My FEMA background told me a worst-case scenario was brewing if Hurricane Cameron curved our way. Greg uncovered that Karen's demolition might skirt the edges of local codes. The law required certain multi-family dwellings or large developments to maintain storm safety measures. But Gulfview Isles was a mix of single-family homes, so the requirements were murky. Even the local building inspector didn't object, likely swayed by Karen's claim that a sturdy new clubhouse would handle storms. Without direct proof of code violations, an injunction seemed unlikely. As a next step, I considered revealing my job. If the community knew I was head of FEMA, they might rally behind me. But I hesitated, not wanting to appear like I was throwing around government clout unfairly. Still, the threat was real. My sense of professional duty warred with my desire for a peaceful private life. At an informal neighborhood gathering, Ms. Daniels and others asked me to speak against Karen in the next HOA session. She took away our safety net. "We have to fight back," they pleaded. Touched by their trust, I agreed. If logic didn't sway Karen, maybe public pressure would. Yet deep inside, a nagging fear grew that a storm might come before we could force a reversal. Hurricane Cameron continued to churn across the Atlantic, intensifying faster than expected. The National Hurricane Center upgraded it to Category 2, then Category 3 within days. Spaghetti models, those lines showing potential storm paths, included a strong chance of landfall somewhere along our stretch of coastline. Alarm spread among local meteorologists. The entire region braced for the possibility that we might be in the crosshairs. The next HOA meeting arrived amid rising tension. Residents packed the community hall, anxious. Karen took her seat at the front, a smug smile on her lips as she described how the clubhouse foundation was poured. She insisted everything was perfectly on track despite the storm watch. Then she dismissed Hurricane Cameron as media hype, telling the crowd, "We'll be fine. Evacuate if you're scared, but let's not waste time or money on doomsday shelters." I stood, voice firm. "Karen, weather experts are forecasting landfall in our region. With the community shelters gone, many of us have no quick refuge. This is dangerously irresponsible." She narrowed her eyes. "You don't seem to understand. People can drive to the city shelters if it gets bad. That's what highways are for. Our neighborhood doesn't need ugly bunkers." End of story. Residents murmured in alarm. One gentleman raised his hand, explaining how his mother was bedridden, making evacuation nearly impossible on short notice. Karen's response was shockingly callous. "Then arrange an ambulance or something." The HOA can't cater to every personal situation. That was it. My frustration boiled over. I drew a shaky breath. Karen, I happen to work in emergency management at a very high level. Your choice to demolish those shelters is a direct threat to the lives of everyone here if a severe hurricane hits. She sneered. Emergency management at a high level? And I'm supposed to bow to your fear-mongering? Spare me the theatrics. I realized my partial reveal wasn't enough to sway her. Her arrogance was unshakable. The meeting ended in chaos, with neighbors demanding solutions, Karen refusing to budge, and tension so thick you could slice it. Storm watchers said Cameron might approach within days. We had precious little time to prepare for a worst-case scenario. As Hurricane Cameron barreled closer, the official forecast grew dire. The system reached Category 4, with sustained winds over 130 miles per hour. The governor declared a state of emergency, urging coastal residents to prepare or evacuate. I, along with FEMA staff, shifted into crisis mode, coordinating resources, checking city shelters, staging supplies, all while juggling the personal reality that my own neighborhood's local shelters were gone. Karen, unbelievably, continued building her clubhouse. Trucks delivered materials, ignoring the swirling warnings. Some neighbors panicked, planning to evacuate days in advance. Others, especially the elderly or those with health issues, fretted about traffic jams and late departures. Ms. Daniels and her wheelchair-bound father planned to leave early, but not everyone had that option. Finally, 2 days before potential landfall, city officials recommended a voluntary evacuation of Gulfview Isles. That's when the meltdown began. Highways clogged with cars, gas stations ran out of fuel, hotels inland filled up. Some families tried leaving, only to turn back, citing endless traffic or lack of lodging. A sense of dread filled the air. In the midst of this, Karen posted a smug note on the HOA website. All is under control. If you can't handle a storm, leave. Don't expect the HOA to cater to doomsday preppers. Her words, dismissive of a Category 4 hurricane, were beyond shocking. People bombarded the forum with outrage, demanding the shelters be rebuilt or alternative safety measures provided. She refused. That night, I made a decision. I donned my official FEMA jacket, marched to Karen's house, and knocked firmly. She opened the door, eyes widening at my attire. I told you I work in emergency management. Actually, I'm Alexandra Hollingsworth, director of FEMA, I declared. Her jaw dropped. I'm here in an official capacity to demand you cease your clubhouse construction and address the shelter crisis. She sputtered, face reddening. You can't just order me around to my own HOA. I calmly explained that ignoring official hurricane warnings could lead to massive liability. If you stand in the way of community safety, I'll ensure you face legal consequences for endangering residents. She looked rattled, but her pride bristled. I have rights. This is private property. The hurricane might not even come here, she insisted. Then she slammed the door in my face. I returned home, anger pulsing. I tried the direct approach, but Karen's denial was absolute. With a monstrous storm approaching, time was almost up. We needed immediate action to safeguard the neighbors who couldn't evacuate. My next steps would be more drastic, pulling official levers as FEMA director. Because at this point, it wasn't just an HOA squabble. It was a matter of life or death. Hurricane Cameron neared, its projected path zeroing in on our coastal county. Forecasters said landfall might be a mere 36 hours away. I orchestrated a scramble among FEMA staff to deploy emergency resources. We arranged additional city shelters, portable generators, and rescue teams. But for my own neighborhood, Gulfview Isles, there was no quick fix for the lost bunkers. At 6 a.m. the next morning, I conferred with local officials, urging them to require mandatory evacuation for Gulfview Isles, given our compromised state. The mayor agreed, signing an evacuation order effective immediately. Police and emergency crews roamed the streets, blaring announcements. Residents must evacuate. Category 4 hurricane imminent. Some neighbors packed up and fled. Others, lacking options or skeptical of the severity, stayed. Karen, in defiance, posted on social media, "This is fear-based overreaction. Don't let these officials disrupt your property." Her clubhouse construction continued until the mandatory evacuation forced the crews to leave. She alone remained, claiming her house was stormproof. The sense of disbelief among neighbors was palpable. She was ignoring a direct government order, risking her life and potentially others who might try to rescue her. Meanwhile, I tried to help coordinate rides for those who didn't have vehicles or finances for hotels. Ms. Daniels left with her father, thankful. But many were stuck. With the bunkers gone, no local fallback existed. It broke my heart to see families tearfully departing, not knowing if they'd have homes to return to. By midday, storm clouds loomed on the horizon, winds picking up. Rain spattered the empty streets. I had to oversee broader FEMA operations at the city's emergency center, but my mind stayed on Gulfview Isles. A few defiant residents, including Karen, had chosen to remain. The local sheriff's department had bigger problems than forcibly removing them, so they let them be. That evening, the outer bands of Cameron arrived, gusty winds and torrential rain lashing the coast. The city went into lockdown mode. As FEMA director, I was in constant communication with the governor, the National Weather Service, and local agencies. Yet each moment, I imagined Karen's face, her smug assurance that everything's fine. But everything was far from fine. The storm surge threatened to flood Gulfview Isles, and no neighborhood shelter stood to protect them. Darkness fell, and Hurricane Cameron unleashed its fury. Wind howled at 130 miles per hour, snapping trees, ripping shingles off roofs. Streets turned into rivers as storm surge pushed seawater onto land. In the Emergency Operations Center, I monitored real-time data, dispatching rescue teams where feasible. But the conditions were too dangerous for most vehicles. Even National Guard was pinned down in some areas. Near midnight, a frantic call came through from the local 911 dispatch to my FEMA command post. A resident of Gulfview Isles was trapped, house flooding rapidly, needing urgent rescue. The address? Karen's house. My breath caught. She'd stayed behind, ignoring all warnings, and now was in dire straits. The 911 operator said Karen was panicking, claiming water was chest-high, walls shaking. She was screaming for help, cursing that no one was there to save her. I wrestled with conflicting emotions. This woman's arrogance had endangered the entire community. Yet I was a public servant, sworn to help even those who caused the crisis. I radioed the Coast Guard team, requesting they attempt a rescue by boat if conditions allowed. The response? "We can try once the wind subsides a bit, but it's extremely perilous." I nodded grimly, acknowledging they'd do their best. Soon, more calls from Gulfview Isles poured in. A handful of folks had remained. Their streets were flooded, homes battered by debris. The few who once relied on the bunkers had nowhere to go. The entire area was a disaster zone. My heart sank. If only Karen hadn't demolished the shelters. This was the exact scenario we dreaded. Around 2 a.m., the eye of the hurricane briefly passed over, offering a lull in the wind. The Coast Guard launched a swift rescue boat and an amphibious truck. We guided them via radio to Gulfview Isles' main entrance, partially submerged. They navigated swirling waters, passing submerged cars, pieces of roofing, and toppled palm trees. They reached Karen Street. Houses half submerged, battered by waves. They found Karen clinging to a second-floor window ledge, screaming for help. Her face was pale, hair drenched. The boat crew pulled her aboard, along with 2 other stranded neighbors. All were rushed to a safer zone. Karen, sobbing, reportedly kept saying, "I didn't know it'd be this bad. Where were the shelters?" The irony was devastating. Throughout the night, dozens more were evacuated from the ravaged streets. The howling wind resumed as the eye passed, but our rescue teams pressed on heroically. By dawn, Hurricane Cameron moved inland, weakening. The toll on Gulfview Isles was staggering. Entire blocks flooded, homes destroyed, and ironically, the partially built clubhouse in ruins. But at least lives were spared, thanks to emergency responders. Karen, left with only the clothes on her back, had to face the consequences of her folly. The morning after the hurricane, I ventured out with a FEMA assessment team, once winds calmed enough for safe travel. We navigated debris-littered roads, now passable only with high-clearance vehicles. Gulfview Isles was in shambles, floodwaters still knee-deep, shattered windows, roofs torn off. The empty foundation where the community shelters once stood was a muddy crater. If they'd remained, many could have sheltered there. Instead, it was a tragedy of one person's hubris. We established a relief station near the main entrance, distributing water, blankets, and medical aid. Exhausted residents trickled in, including some who had refused to evacuate. Many were bruised, shaken but alive. Among them was Karen, wrapped in a donated blanket, eyes hollow with shock. She spotted me in my FEMA jacket, approached gingerly. "Director Hollingsworth," she began in a trembling voice. I'm sorry. I never thought it'd be this violent. I lost everything. My house, all gone." Tears welled in her eyes. "If only I'd listened." She let out a choked sob. "Those shelters, we needed them." She couldn't finish. Seeing her remorseful, even broken, stirred complicated feelings. Part of me felt vindication. Her arrogance had literally washed away. But mostly I felt pity. No one deserved the terror of that night. Softly, I responded, "This is exactly why we keep storm shelters. Hurricanes are unpredictable. People's lives depended on them." She nodded, tears streaming. "I see that now." The press soon arrived, capturing footage of the devastation. They discovered that the HOA official who tore down shelters was ironically among those rescued. Public outrage flared. Karen's name became synonymous with irresponsible leadership. Meanwhile, I coordinated immediate relief efforts. FEMA mobilized temporary housing, while the Red Cross set up cots in nearby schools. Volunteers fanned out to help salvage what they could. But the road to recovery was long. Some residents lost their homes entirely. Others faced expensive damage. Ms. Daniels, returning from her evacuation, found her house partly flooded but still standing. She was grateful her father was safe, but furious about the lost shelters that might have sheltered neighbors who didn't or couldn't flee. Karen, for her part, slunk around in a daze, realizing the clubhouse fiasco was not only a financial bust, but a moral failure. The next few weeks would bring harsh reckoning from neighbors, insurers, and possibly the law. Meanwhile, as FEMA director, I had to remain professional, ensuring all got help, even Karen. In the days following the storm, the damage assessment pegged Gulfview Isles as one of the hardest-hit neighborhoods. FEMA declared the area a disaster zone, unlocking federal funds for rebuilding. My presence there, once covert, was now explicit. As newscasts picked up the story, FEMA director lives in ravaged neighborhood where HOA shelters were demolished. Reporters grilled Karen for comment, but she mostly avoided them, shell-shocked and likely fearing legal ramifications. Some neighbors demanded she resign from the HOA board, outraged that her actions directly contributed to the chaos. The board convened an emergency session, during which Karen tearfully resigned, citing mistakes in judgment. Tension soared as residents accused her of endangerment, pointing out that if not for the city's rescue teams, more would have perished. Meanwhile, city officials discussed potential charges. The local building authority found Karen had bypassed required reviews before destroying critical infrastructure designated for emergencies. The county attorney suggested possible civil or even criminal charges of negligence. Insurance companies also threatened to deny claims for the damage to the clubhouse site, as it was unapproved construction that compromised storm preparedness. Throughout this turmoil, I focused on relief efforts. I arranged for FEMA's temporary housing units to be deployed to families who lost everything. Volunteers set up a distribution center for food, water, clothing. The hum of construction equipment filled the air, hauling debris away. Each day, the battered landscape slowly stabilized. Karen approached me again, this time in front of a relief tent, tears in her eyes. "Director Hollingsworth, I want to help. I realize how wrong I was. Is there anything I can do?" I studied her face. The once haughty sneer was gone, replaced by genuine regret. After a moment, I suggested she volunteer with the cleanup crew, deliver supplies, apologize to neighbors. She nodded vigorously. Over time, Karen's efforts at restitution became visible. She joined salvage teams, assisting families in need. Some neighbors scorned her, refusing her help, but others allowed her to lift debris or hand out blankets. She seemed determined to atone. Whether it was genuine contrition or desperation to avoid lawsuits, I couldn't say. But at least she was acknowledging the damage she caused. The rest of us pressed on, rebuilding and healing. Weeks stretched into months as Gulf View Isles gradually rose from the wreckage. FEMA grants helped repair roads and restore utilities. Residents rebuilt homes, some choosing to fortify with hurricane-resistant materials. The clubhouse project was abandoned. No one wanted to revisit that fiasco. Instead, talk arose about constructing new, modern storm shelters, possibly financed through a combination of HOA dues, FEMA guidance, and city support. Karen's downfall was swift. She'd resigned from the HOA board, faced multiple lawsuits from residents and contractors, and found herself the subject of intense local media scrutiny. Some coverage called her the ultimate cautionary tale of HOA power run amok. Others revealed how she'd manipulated votes to push her clubhouse plan. Potential criminal charges were still pending: negligence or reckless endangerment for demolishing shelters. She sought legal counsel, but her reputation lay in shambles. Despite the hostility around her, I saw glimmers of remorse. She joined every volunteer drive, raising funds for new shelters, apologizing publicly. At a community meeting, she addressed the neighbors. My arrogance blinded me to the real dangers of hurricanes. "I cost us our shelters. I'm sorry." Though some responded with anger, others recognized her sincere regret. The tragedy she endured during the storm, nearly losing her life, had evidently changed her perspective. For me, balancing my role as a neighbor with that of FEMA director was exhausting. Yet I felt relief that most folks survived, albeit with heartbreak and property damage. Ms. Daniels, for instance, qualified for a housing repair grant. She told me, "If it weren't for you pushing rescue resources here, we might have lost everything." I simply nodded, thinking if only we'd had the shelters, it might have been easier. In the end, the calamity served as a brutal lesson in preparedness. No vanity project is worth sacrificing public safety. Hurricanes don't negotiate, and they don't spare arrogance. Karen's dream of a private clubhouse lay buried under rubble, replaced by a renewed communal commitment to storm readiness. As reconstruction progressed, a surprising sense of unity emerged in Gulf View Isles. Neighbors who once barely spoke now collaborated on rebuilding each other's homes, sharing tools and labor. Local church groups delivered meals, and volunteer organizations assisted seniors. The sense of communal spirit overshadowed the bitterness left by Karen's scheme. City leaders and I helped draft a plan for new shelters, modern, ADA accessible, with robust materials. The design included multi-purpose usage, like a community center, but integrated safe rooms specifically for storms. Funding discussions ensued, with FEMA offering partial grants if the HOA provided matching funds. Residents enthusiastically supported it, wanting never again to face a catastrophic hurricane without local refuge. Karen's fate lingered uncertain. The lawsuits advanced, alleging her demolition of the old shelters violated local disaster codes. During depositions, she recounted the fateful night of the hurricane, crying as she described nearly drowning. She offered to pay restitution, though her finances were limited. Many suspected she'd lose her house to settlements. The criminal case, meanwhile, might end in probation or a suspended sentence if she cooperated fully. Some argued for jail time, but the district attorney was weighing the complexities. Through it all, I mostly kept out of the legal drama, focusing on FEMA's mission. I'd occasionally cross paths with Karen at volunteer events. She always wore a haunted expression, as though she couldn't shake the guilt. One day, she timidly approached me. "I heard the new shelters plan is moving forward. I'd like to donate some of my own funds if it helps." I studied her. "That's generous. Every bit helps. But the real cost was in lives nearly lost. She lowered her gaze. I know. I'm sorry. I believe she was sincere. We parted ways in an uneasy truce. She was no longer the tyrannical HOA queen, just a broken woman seeking redemption in the wreckage she helped create. By late spring, Gulfview Isles looked dramatically improved. The scars of Hurricane Cameron lingered, some vacant lots where homes once stood, battered palm trees. But roads were repaved, utilities restored, and new construction soared. Meanwhile, the brand-new storm shelter complex, dubbed Gulfview Safe Haven, began taking shape in the Greenbelt. Where the clubhouse foundation once lay, bulldozers now installed deep footings for a reinforced structure that could withstand a Category 5 hurricane. Neighbors felt pride in the project. The design integrated community rooms for everyday gatherings, plus robust safe rooms for actual storms. This time, the entire HOA voted overwhelmingly in favor. No illusions about aesthetic concerns overshadowing safety. The local press covered it, praising the transformation from a cautionary tale to a shining example of resilience. Karen's lawsuits reached a settlement. She paid fines, lost her seat on the board permanently, and agreed to do community service working with local emergency preparedness initiatives. The criminal case ended with a plea deal, probation plus mandatory classes on disaster awareness. Ironically, some folks wanted her punished more, but the general sentiment was relief. She'd publicly admitted wrongdoing and helped finance a fraction of the new shelter's cost. One warm afternoon, Ms. Daniels caught me in the grocery store. Did you hear Karen's building a public apology plaque near the new shelter using her own money? I raised my eyebrows. Ms. Daniels nodded. She wants it to read, in memory of those who faced Hurricane Cameron without protection. May we never forget the value of preparedness. I exhaled, struck by the gesture. A year ago, I couldn't imagine Karen acknowledging fault, let alone building a memorial. While some called it a PR stunt, I sensed genuine remorse. The storm had nearly claimed her life, hammered her illusions. She'd walked away with a second chance, albeit under the weight of her neighbor's anger. But in time, perhaps the community might forgive her. Meanwhile, I was just grateful we had tangible progress, a stronger, safer neighborhood. Months later, the new shelter complex reached completion. The HOA planned a grand opening ceremony, inviting local officials, the media, and residents. I stood among the crowd, heart swelling with pride. The building looked formidable. Hurricane shutters, thick concrete walls, backup generators. Inside, multipurpose rooms boasted comfortable chairs and bright decor. The safe rooms were windowless vaults, braced to withstand monstrous winds. At the ceremony, the HOA president, a kind man who replaced Karen, delivered remarks about learning from mistakes. A city council member praised the partnership with FEMA. Then the microphone passed to me. As director of FEMA and a homeowner here, I spoke about the crucial lesson Cameron taught us. Disaster readiness isn't optional. It's essential. One person's vanity nearly cost us dearly, but we emerged stronger by uniting in recovery. Applause rippled through the audience. Some older folks dabbed tears, recalling the terror of that night. Ms. Daniels, with her father in a wheelchair, smiled widely, grateful for the new accessible space. Volunteers beamed at the building they helped construct. In that moment, the tragedy that spurred this project felt overshadowed by hope and resilience. Karen stood at the back, head lowered, listening intently. When the ceremony ended, she quietly approached the newly unveiled plaque. It bore a solemn inscription about preparedness, referencing Hurricane Cameron's date. Karen ran her fingers over the letters, tears brimming. She'd donated funds for it, fulfilling her vow of apology. Some neighbors eyed her warily, others offered polite nods. Redemption was a slow path, but this was a start. That evening, a modest potluck broke out inside the new facility's multipurpose room. Neighbors laughing, children playing. The walls that once separated them, fear, distrust, anger, crumbled as they shared a meal in a structure that symbolized safety. I sipped iced tea, smiling, relieved that a fiasco had birthed genuine progress. If a future storm struck, we'd be ready. Time slipped by, and the memory of Hurricane Cameron gradually faded in a local lore. But the new shelters stood as a permanent reminder of the hurricane's ferocity and the catastrophic mistake of demolishing the old bunkers. Each summer, the HOA organized preparedness drills, ensuring everyone knew how to use the facility in an emergency. Children learned about storms in a less fearful context, trusting the shelter's presence. Karen, stripped of her power, dedicated herself to volunteer work. She joined a local disaster relief nonprofit, ironically distributing hurricane preparedness brochures door to door. Some found it humorous, but others recognized her earnestness. She eventually moved out of Gulfview Isles, seeking a fresh start elsewhere. Rumors said she wrote letters of apology to several families who endured the storm without shelter. Her actions had left deep scars, but also spurred a cautionary tale that shaped the community's future. My role in FEMA continued, though I balanced it with the quiet life at Gulfview Isles. Each hurricane season, I'd keep a watchful eye on the tropics, ensuring the region was as prepared as possible. If a new storm approached, I took comfort knowing my neighbors had a safe haven. The dread of repeating Cameron's chaos lessened, replaced by quiet confidence in our robust facility. Every so often, the press revisited our story, calling it a shining example of learning from tragedy. They interviewed me or Ms. Daniels about the transformation from an HOA fiasco to a model of storm readiness. We always stressed the real heroes were the neighbors who banded together after the hurricane, building a safer future. The heartbreak of that night forged an unbreakable bond among us. On the one-year anniversary of Hurricane Cameron, Gulfview Isles held a reflective gathering at the new storm shelter. Candles lined the walkway, each flame representing a home rebuilt or a life saved. Residents recounted memories of that fateful night. The roaring wind, the swirling floodwaters, the terror that overshadowed reason. They also celebrated how rescue teams, volunteers, and a sense of community overcame despair. A local pastor led a short prayer for those impacted, followed by Ms. Daniels reading a poem about resilience. Then the HOA president invited me to speak. Standing near the plaque Karen funded, I spoke from the heart. Last year, we faced unimaginable danger. We lost the bunkers that once stood here, but we found in ourselves the resolve to build something better. This shelter behind us isn't just concrete. It's a symbol of unity and second chances. Applause rose. Some folks wept softly. The old divisions seemed distant. The memory of Karen's clubhouse fiasco served as a lesson in humility. Nature's fury demands respect, not denial. The ceremony ended with neighbors hugging, families lighting small lanterns and letting them float in a nearby retention pond, signifying letting go of the past pain. In that moment, the spirit of Gulfview Isles felt unbreakable. Hurricane Cameron had tested us, taking advantage of one woman's hubris to devastate our community. But from the wreckage, we emerged stronger, guided by communal empathy and a renewed respect for nature's might. A new hurricane season rolled in, but this time, we faced it with preparation. The new facility was fully stocked with emergency rations, cots, medical supplies, and backup generators. Drills ensured residents knew how to quickly gather there if needed. Ms. Daniels served as a volunteer coordinator, greeting new homeowners with a friendly welcome packet explaining the shelter's significance. One day, I received a letter postmarked from another state. It was from Karen. She wrote, "Director Hollingsworth, I'm living in a quiet town now, working in a local Red Cross chapter. I've learned so much since that terrible storm. I wanted to thank you for not giving up on me or the community, even when I deserved it. I hope you can forgive my arrogance. Perhaps, in time, the people of Gulfview Isles can too. M. Ardini, Karen." I reread the letter, feeling a complex mix of relief and closure. People can change, shaped by tragedy. If Karen truly dedicated herself to preventing disasters elsewhere, then at least something good emerged from the wreckage. I penned a polite reply, wishing her success in her new path and expressing hope that we all continue to learn from our mistakes. In Gulfview Isles, life flowed on. Children grew up with an annual Hurricane Safety Day. Local gardeners replanted wind-torn palm trees, and the lovely pastel homes thrived once more. Whenever a storm watch arose, we calmly readied the shelter, ensuring no one would face the fate we narrowly escaped. The haunting memory of Cameron was softened by the knowledge that we'd never again be left so vulnerable. Years passed, and the storms came and went, some mild, others fierce. Each time, Gulfview Isles weathered them better than before, thanks to the robust shelter. Slowly, the final scars from Cameron faded. Rebuilt homes, replanted yards, new families moving in with no memory of the fiasco. Yet the story lived on in community lore, told by longtime residents as a cautionary tale about hubris and the importance of collective safety. I continued my dual life, leading FEMA across the nation when disasters struck, then returning to my cozy coastal home. The neighbors treated me not as some distant official, but as a friend. Ms. Daniels once joked, "No other neighborhood can brag that the FEMA director is their neighbor." My presence reassured them that if trouble brewed, they had a direct line to top-tier support. One balmy evening, strolling by the shelter, I noticed a small group of teens leaning against a structure, reading the memorial plaque. They murmured about how the old shelters were bulldozed before the big storm, how an HOA official nearly cost them all. It sounded like a ghost story to them. Unthinkable that anyone would do such a thing. I smiled wryly, recalling how real and terrifying it was. As the teens walked away, I quietly placed a hand on the plaque. It read, "In memory of the night Hurricane Cameron tested our shores. Let us forever remember that no personal ambition outweighs the safety of many. Built by the community, for the community, with gratitude for second chances." Below it, in smaller letters, donated in part by M. Ardini. Perhaps that final footnote symbolized redemption, a woman who realized her error too late but worked to rectify it. Exhaling, I turned to gaze at the horizon. The ocean glimmered under the setting sun, waves gentle for now. But I knew storms could come again. That's the nature of life on the coast, and the nature of life in general. Preparedness, humility, and unity were our strongest defenses. And in Gulfview Isles, we'd learned that lesson the hard way, but emerged with a happy ending, a safer, stronger, and more compassionate home. Today, Gulfview Isles stands as a testament to how a neighborhood can bounce back from the brink of disaster, even one partly caused by internal sabotage. The once doomed shelters are now replaced by a state-of-the-art facility that doubles as a community center and life-saving hurricane refuge. Residents gather there for potlucks, craft fairs, and block parties. Come storm season, it morphs into a fortress that can shield hundreds. Karen, whose ignorance and arrogance triggered the fiasco, found a path toward atonement, albeit from afar. She remains a cautionary figure, but also a reminder that we can learn from our worst mistakes. The legal repercussions she faced underscored that endangering community safety has real consequences. Her personal transformation, however incomplete, offered a measure of closure. As for me, I continue splitting my time between FEMA's national responsibilities and the quiet joys of coastal living. Whenever I pass by the shelter at dusk, the lights within glowing softly, I feel a wave of gratitude. I recall the night Hurricane Cameron howled through, and the terrifying moment I realized our old bunkers were gone. But we survived, we rebuilt, and we grew closer as neighbors. In the end, the moral resonates clearly. No single person's vanity or misguided ambition should ever override communal well-being, especially in the face of natural disasters. Hurricanes don't heed property lines or HOA rules. They demand respect, preparation, and humility. Gulfview Isles learned that lesson painfully, but the outcome stands as a happy ending depending on what truly matters. Lives saved, resilience fortified, and a community bound tighter than ever by shared adversity.